All right. Hi, PBio. So I want to talk right now about ATP, which is going to be the energy that your cells can use to do work. So ATP, when you think about eating food or a plant who makes their own food, that's great. There's a lot of stored energy in food, but in order for our cells to be able to use that, we need to be able to transfer it to ATP. And so today what we're going to talk about is just the structure of it, the hydrolysis of it, and how that helps to power cells and allow them to do their jobs. So this first part here, ATP does work by coupling exergonic reactions. Exergonic, remember, are reactions that release energy or have a negative delta G, change in Gibbs free energy, and so you couple this exergonic energy releasing reaction to endergonic reactions, or a reaction that requires an input of energy. And so this process of using these two reactions kind of together is called energy coupling. And so before we look at really how ATP kind of does that, what I want to say is just kind of point out the structure of it. So we should have seen this before. We remember that ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. Okay, and so when we look at this molecule, what we have here, we have this nitrogenous base adenine. We have this sugar, ribose. And then we have these three phosphate groups. When you see adenosine or ADP, which would be adenosine diphosphate, it's just two. AMP, adenosine monophosphate, would be just one. So hopefully that makes sense and you remember this. So when we talk about the energy releasing reaction that powers cells, we call it the hydrolysis of ATP. And so hopefully you remember that hydrolysis is using water to split molecules. Okay. And so the opposite of this would be dehydration synthesis, where you add water in order to bond molecules together. And so when we think about the hydrolysis of ATP, what we look at is we say that when we take ATP and we add it to water, which you kind of see right here, ATP plus water, it will form ADP, or adenosine diphosphate. Hopefully you see those two phosphates there, and this sort of inorganic phosphate molecule. This process releases a ton of energy. And if you actually just took a bunch of ATP molecules and added it to water in a test tube, that energy would just be released as heat, and that test tube would get really warm in your hand. Instead, what your cells do is they use this hydrolysis, they couple this exergonic release of energy with a process that requires energy that is endergonic. And so we're going to look at that in a second. I do want to talk about this question because we tend to get a little confused about this. Why is it incorrect to say that the release of energy from ATP being hydrolyzed, the process we just talked about above, comes from the phosphate bonds? And we kind of sometimes fall into the trap of saying this. What we really want to focus on is the idea that, if I draw this little graph here, right? If we had a bar chart that demonstrated the amount of free energy in the reactants, which would be ATP and water, that's going to be much more than the amount of free energy in the products, or ADP, and that inorganic phosphate. And so what this question is trying to point you to is trying to describe how the change in free energy between the reactants and the products is kind of what you want to talk about and focus on here. Not necessarily the bond being broken. You want to look at this guy. So when we talk about how your cells do this, there's a couple examples here. The big one that you want to talk or focus on is the fact that if you have a reaction that requires an input of energy that is less than the release of energy from the hydrolysis of ATP, so I'll point you to this. This is the amount of energy required to perform this reaction up here. So it requires an input of 3.4 kilocalories per mole. The hydrolysis of ATP right here releases 7.3 kilocalories per mole, which is greater than a bigger energy release than is required to do this reaction. And so the first part of understanding this is if you release more energy than you need to put in, then you can couple these two reactions together. And it will all, like overall, then technically it would be an exergonic reaction. And we see that with that negative delta G. The second thing I want to point you to is that a lot of these reactions are going to use phosphorylated intermediates, which are sort of unstable molecules. And so that phosphate group from ATP gets attached to this sort of like intermediate molecule, a molecule that's not the reactant, not the product, somewhere in the middle. And it's really unstable. And so that helps kind of keep the reaction going. So that's just what that was talking about there. We talk a lot about shape change in this class. And so kind of point you to that. In this next example, it's just showing a couple different things. Similarly, we see, how these releases of energy are going to help do endergonic process or power endergonic reactions. Similarly, right here, right, we see this sort of phosphorylated molecule, and that's going to help those shape changes that we talked about before are going to also help move these substances across the membrane in a process that requires the energy released from ATP. All right, so that's energy coupling. And then lastly, this kind of idea of the regeneration of ATP. So just a couple things I want to point out for here. So, when I do the hydrolysis of ATP, it's going to release energy. So that reaction would be exergonic. And so then that exergonic release of energy can become energy for cellular work. So to be able to power endergonic processes, okay? On the other hand, you do use dehydration synthesis, sort of part of this, to reattach, I should say to form a bond between a second and a third phosphate to regenerate ATP. And so that's going to require energy. So forming ATP will be an endergonic process. But the really nice thing is that your cells, because it recycles ADP so much, it's easier to regenerate ATP much quicker. So your cells can just keep doing work. And so I think, that's really what I wanted to point out about this. The regeneration process is really quick, which is really helpful because your cells just keep using energy.